welcome to episode 6 of Spark After Hours, a podcast where we talk all things STEAM. My name's Rajul.
And my name's Ananya, and we'll be your hosts for today. For those who haven't been following us for a while, Spark is a youth-led nonprofit organization founded in 2018, and we try to engage students in the worlds of science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. Normally, we host 24-hour hackathons like we did in 2018 and 2019, but of course, because of the pandemic, we've had to shift our events a little bit, and our most recent virtual initiative was in August, where we hosted Spark from Home, which was a virtual hackathon.
Today, we have a super interesting guest with us here. Her name is Suzanne Balima, who is an accomplished innovation designer and consultant. We'll be talking about design, diversity, and all of her unique experiences. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So first, we're going to start off with some basic questions just to get to know you. So would you mind telling us a bit about yourself and I guess what you're doing right now?
Sure. So a little bit about myself. So I have a bachelor in biomedical engineering, and what drew me there was my love for just understanding how things work and how you could help in healthcare more generally. Along the way, I dabbled into technology kind of by accident, to be honest. It was a buzzword. It was up and coming. Everyone was talking about it. I knew I hated coding, so I was like, it's probably not for me. But at some point, I feel like you just take the signals that the universe is sending you. So I figured, you know what, let's give it a try. And I did. I'm really glad because it opened a whole door of opportunities. So one of them being, so I started off my career basically implementing technology for clients. And along the way, I realized, well, we implement a lot of technology, but we don't really think about the people that are using the technology. So it's almost more forcing the technology on people versus seeing how people need the technology so that we can implement, in a way that's more helpful. And along that path, I discovered user-centric design, which opened up my design, the door to design, let's say. And so after that, I went into UX for a little while and then did a master's in innovation design. So that's essentially balancing how do you make products that are new, innovative, add value to business, but also think about the people at the end of the day. So the users, the customers, the employees, whatever the context is. And so in my role today, what I do is essentially that. So I'm part of a technology group and we're looking to grow the business in many different ways. The difficulty in innovation is you don't really always know where you're supposed to be headed because you're trying to grow essentially. So I love the fact that I get to explore, do we want to create a new business? Do we want to create a new product, a new service? But because I am in the technology group and technology drives a lot of innovation today, then there's also a heavy component of looking at the different technologies that are being used or trending and that kind of stuff. So it's juggling technology, business, and my business background on a day-to-day basis.
That's super interesting. I think we're both kind of interested in like the intersection between them, and that's what Spark does as well. So it's great to see that you've kind of gone down that path, and you've had some amazing educational experiences. So do you mind expanding kind of on that and telling us about what you've been able to do from when you were a student to now?
My bachelor, biomedical mechanical engineering. So a lot of, well, the mechanical foundation is more so looking at moving parts. So different pieces and different components have to come together, but they're not static, so they're in motion. But that was specifically also looking at those applications in a biomedical context. So a lot of prosthetics. So if you need a knee replacement, a hip replacement, a new heart, creating that artificially, knowing that the person will be walking, so there will be motion. The heart needs to pump, so there will be motion. So that's kind of where my initial, I guess, education came. I think what that allowed me to do is really think of things from a systems perspective and a non-static perspective, because you're always constantly thinking about the consequences of something moving. And so you really have to keep in mind, the overall system and how everything connects. I also think that brought a lot of the critical thinking. When I speak to people today, I don't think I do very core engineering work, but I think the training I received being an engineer just brought a lot of, the things you do as an engineer affect people's lives. If a building collapses, people die. If a car or a plane, it's not doing well, then people die. So that thinking around whatever you put out in the world is affecting humanity. I think that's an important piece of my education as well that follows me, whether or not I am doing engineering work. In terms of design, I think the biggest component there is just thinking outside the box. So I often say that my design background is probably, or my design master's was probably the hardest thing I had to study. A lot of people are like, oh my gosh, you're engineering. Oh my gosh, engineers are so smart. I'm like, not really, because there's a model. You just have to kind of be logical about how things work. But design, because there is no predetermined path, you really have to kind of just pick a direction and follow your gut and explore. And there's a lot of confidence in that, I think, in just kind of going a certain way and just not knowing what's going to happen, exploring your creativity. But also at the end of the day, which is something I think people forget when they think about design, is that in design, everything is intentional. So you're not just putting stuff to put stuff. So you're really focusing on the things that matter. If you think, for instance, of a pair of, I'm not going to drop brand names, but brands that do really good running shoes, for instance, every stitch, every single piece of anything that's in that shoe has been thought of, right? It's not just, there's obviously a lot of embellishment as well, but a lot of it is functionality first. And I think people forget that a lot. So I think what the design side of it brings is not only just feeling confident in your decision making, but it's also whatever you're doing, do it for a purpose. Do it for the function first, and then the aesthetic second. So yeah.
So I guess adding on to that, or I guess branching off of that, how exactly did you know that you wanted to pursue design? Was there specific experiences that maybe you went through in your childhood or in high school that kind of got you set on the path?
No, honestly, it was all experimental. So I think keeping an open mind really is what led me there. So when I was in technology, a lot of implementation in technology is, you pick a vendor, so you kind of know what technology you're going to use, and then you're kind of just putting it in place, right? And what I felt was missing from that was the impact, right? Like, I don't know how people who use this feel about this thing that I implemented. Um, and so I think I was missing that human connection, which honestly was by accident. Someone was giving a workshop on user experience design. I didn't know what it was. And I went and I checked it out and I was like, oh, this is actually very interesting. And so in my mind, it was almost like, okay, this whole tech, very, code, looking at stuff part feels unhuman to me. But that other side, which was user experience, is kind of like bridging both. It's like, how do you make sure whatever this ugly look, well, I think code is ugly, but whatever this ugly background looking thing is, it can actually relate to people in a certain way. I thought that to me was a part that excited me. So it was more of mm, thinking about what I thought was missing and finding it, and then kind of like exploring it a little bit more to see, along that path where I wanted to go. So I wouldn't say that even for my bachelor in engineering, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. To this day, I think it's really hard to say, when people ask you in an interview, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I'm like, there's so many variables. Like, I don't know if I'm going to be the same person in 5 years. I don't know if whatever I do today as a job will exist in 5 years. Like, everything moves so fast that I almost find that it's about just being in touch with the things that you find are motivating, the things that make you happy. And to me, making people feel happy using technology was what kind of excited me. So I found that. Doesn't mean, in 3 years I'll still love that. Maybe, maybe not. But for now, it's kind of where I'm at. And I think I also keep an eye open always just to see what else is out there, because you just don't know what you don't know. I mean, there's such a huge universe of careers, topics, domains, industries, new ones popping every day. And I almost feel like you know what you like until you find something else that you like even more. So keeping an open mind is definitely part of it.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for the two of us and also for our audience. Keeping an open mind really does make an impact on what you do. So, how exactly did you get into innovation design after all your education was completed? And where did you work before where you work right now?
Well, the master's I did at that point, I specifically knew that whatever I studied for my master's had to be something I really enjoyed. So my bachelor was like, okay, I kind of like bio stuff. I kind of like engineering, like thinking about, making math and models and whatnot. But there were lots of courses that were just, you had to pass them and move on. So for me, the master's is something I really spent time looking through the courses, like what is offered, do I think I'm going to enjoy this? And I eventually found something where every single course I looked at on the curriculum was, I'm going to love every single part of this. Um, did I know what I would want to do after that? I don't think so. I think for me was just innovation hashtag. Like, I didn't even really know what it meant. So I used to work in a consultancy. I don't know if you want the name, but and it's pretty big, and they have a few innovation departments. So when I came back, my mission was I'm gonna just start in one of those departments and see where that leads me. And I got really lucky that one of the departments, which was the emerging technology lab, was looking for someone with my kind of background. So I transitioned there. tried it out, loved it. It was challenging because I think what school doesn't necessarily give you is the reality of a budget and the reality of, you know, business pressure and delivering results. So we had a lot of projects, we had real clients, but it was almost like a playground, right? Like try what you want, be as crazy as you want, which was great. But then you get to the work environment and it's, you know, we only have X dollars to execute. So you have to also start thinking about within the creative space that I have, what is reasonable, what is not going to freak people out, because business is often very risk averse. So you have to be mindful of all these little other things that just make your job a lot harder. And also the fact that people may not necessarily think the same way you do. So I find when you're creative in a business environment, sometimes it's like you're just speaking a very different language. And that part was probably and is one of the bigger challenges.
Yeah,
Sorry, I don't even know if I answered your question.
no problem. The point is just to have a good discussion, and we're both learning a lot for sure. So, I think moving on kind of to our next topic, design is becoming a really, really popular industry now, and more people want to pursue it. Are there some shifts you've seen kind of in the industry since you've started working as a designer?
But I'll start with design is huge, right? Like there's so many different specialties within design that I don't know that I can speak to all kinds of design. So you'll have, you know, graphic design, which I'm sure shifted a lot. You'll have communication design, which I'm sure has shifted a lot. You have product design, which again, I'm sure has shifted a lot. So the branch of design I do is called strategic design, which is applying the principles of design to a business. So, I mean, at a very high level, if you think of design, typically they have a mood board, right? I'll pick graphic design perhaps to just make it more tangible, but they'll have a mood board, they'll be inspired, and then they'll kind of start to brainstorm some concepts. And then, you know, they'll come up with a few versions of something, and then they'll, you know, pick one or two and keep kind of refining until they're happy. In strategic design, you're basically kind of doing the same with a mood board of potential, you know, business ideas or growth ideas. You'll brainstorm over that, and then you'll kind of refine and start putting more of the impact slash, you know, is it too expensive? Is it actually adding value? Is it, you know, all the more business type of criteria? And then you'll pick. So from that point of view, I would say it's definitely shifted a lot. But I'll speak to it from a business perspective in that, first of all, design was just never a thing that was included. Well, I shouldn't say never, but definitely not to the same extent that it was included in how business was run. But more and more, you'll see people looking for, you know, creative thinking or thinking differently, thinking outside the box, because I think we've reached a point where, you know, the biggest companies have probably reached all the markets by now, because the standard growth pattern is, you know, you create a product, you're really good at it, you go out and then you kind of go into different geographies. But like at some point, you're going to get saturated. Like there's no more countries to go into. So you now have to start thinking about, you know, is there something else I can do with what I can offer? Is there a new service I can offer? And so from that perspective, just even considering like a lot of the businesses I've been in touch with, innovation is now part of most business strategies, like in terms of direction, right? Because if you want to keep growing, that's just something you have to start embedding in everything you do. So I'd say from that perspective, yes. There's also a lot more people enforcing, or companies and not enforcing, but providing training to the whole organization. Whereas in the past, I found that, you know, the designers were kind of just in the design team. So I find that they're a lot more sought after for their input, for their ideas, for the way they work. Um, yeah, I would say those are the big shifts I've seen so far for strategic design.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to see how industry shifts, because things are so different now than they were like even 5 or 10 years ago. So
Mhm.
it's interesting to see how you've observed those shifts too, even where you work. So I recently saw on LinkedIn, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, but you posted about universal design, and I found it to be a pretty interesting concept. So could you tell us a little bit about what universal design is and how you apply it in your work?
I don't know that I apply. That's a sad thing to say in all the projects I work on. But universal design is the concept of making a design accessible to everyone. I'll give you one example. So I'm taking an American Sign Language course, and the teacher is deaf. And if you look at the way Zoom is designed, well, I'm not going to name drop anybody, but most platforms that, you know, you can do audiovisual communication, it's not really friendly to someone who can't hear, right? Like if you're doing something as a teacher and I just start speaking, I'm getting your attention. But if you're a deaf teacher that can't hear, and you have to present something and the chat is minimized. Like there's just so many other things happening. It's really, really difficult to be able to manage. And I've seen that firsthand, probably because I'm a designer. I always pay attention to these things. But to me, it was like, wow, there's just so many basic things that people can't participate in. I mean, they can use it, but there's just so much friction around it. So universal design is really thinking, when you are designing something, thinking about the different people that will need to access it and making sure that it is accessible to everyone. Um, Within that whole bigger realm, oftentimes we also just narrow it down to, deaf people, blind people, but there's also like cognitive abilities, right? Like if I'm dyslexic and a lot of the stuff you're showing me is text, then it's probably going to be an issue. So little things you can do are typically think of various ways someone can access content. So an example, not sure if it's the best, but could be how some news channels will have the person speaking, the anchor, but they'll also have written text and they'll also have someone doing sign language, right? So depending on what's more comfortable for you, you can just still access the content versus, if I can only see, then maybe I'm missing out on the words that are coming. There's a show on Netflix, sidebar. I'm super into like ESL mode right now, but it's a show with that kind of follows a group of people within the deaf community. And another thing that was really hard for me on the other opposite side is they sign everything, right? So for me, it was, oh, great, I can practice, but I'm a beginner, so I'm struggling to listen. And so I have to read a lot. And by reading a lot, I'm missing the whole, whatever visuals are happening. So in reverse, think about someone who is watching Netflix and has to read everything because they're deaf, then they're basically missing out a lot of the detail that is happening visually. So it's basically, when you are designing something, think about all the different ways people can or cannot communicate so they can also have access to the content that you are putting, or the product or the service. And the fun fact is, a lot of these products that are created, like Siri or voice command, started off because it was trying to cater to a specific audience. But typically by catering to, a smaller group of people who need something, it becomes something that's just useful to everyone. Like I know so many people who talk to Siri, who talk to Siri and like respond to text via voice. Like, so it's not that it's something that is restricted to a smaller audience either. It's also something that just makes it easier for everyone at the end of the day.
So that is really interesting to hear and kind of the perfect segue into our next topic. So that ties in with diversity, inclusion, and just acknowledging equity. So based on that, what have your experiences have been in the field as a woman of color in technology?
I'll try and keep it brief. um, well, the first comment or observation is there's just not a lot of us in the field. Thinking out loud, I can probably count the number of women of color that I know. Um, and I think the other thing is when you notice things, so people oftentimes will say it's important to have diversity because you have to foster diversity of thought, because obviously if you're all raised in the same environment and you're all, ingesting the same content, the conclusions and the ideas you're going to have are all going to be the same. So when people push for diversity, they're really pushing for, well, you had a different experience, so you're going to bring that to the table. And it's really hard in the sense that there's just so many things I would notice as a minority. I moved to Canada, so I'm an immigrant. I'm a woman. I'm a woman of color. I didn't go to what is considered like one of the top schools. So, and these are little biases you start to see in the way sometimes people will think about, how they recruit. Let's go to this school because they have good students. And it's like, well, there's good students everywhere. You could still go to every school and find the good students, or whatever good student is defined as, in every school. But there's also the layer of, however those criteria are defined, sometimes doesn't take into consideration your lived experience. And I read an interesting article actually this week that talked about specifically women of color, and how, because navigating, being alone in a lot of environments we're in, there's just this soft skill that starts to develop where you know how to blend in, you know what to say and what not to, like little things like that, that sometimes also people aren't considering in the skill set that, minorities or women of color, or, someone who's just not a minority in general, might not consider it to be a skill to look for. So I mean, my experiences haven't been awful in the sense I've always been in supportive teams. I mean, I've been given opportunities, I would say. But I do feel that sometimes it's just like you have to pick your battles, because there's a lot of battles that you see that other people just may not relate to or think is as important. But when I see myself in the shoes of some of those decisions that are made, the way I look at it is, if I wasn't in this room, I would be excluded from this experience. Therefore, it's important for me to speak up. But you have to balance it all out. That's probably the hardest part of being one of the few in the field.
Yeah, I think it's a really important discussion for us to have just because, we're seeing such a rise even like this year. There were a lot of companies that were coming out with, I don't remember the number, but it was about how a certain percentage of people in every company should be women or should be people of color. So I think it's just something that we need to take into consideration more, but then also walking that fine line between we're hiring you because you're a person of color versus we're hiring you because you're qualified. So I think it's just like a fine line that like women of color just have to walk and to figure things out, I guess.
But I also think you're always qualified, right? Like the moment you get the job, you are qualified. And at the end of the day, that's maybe a piece of advice for you guys as well. But a lot of women, and that's statistically, I don't know the numbers exactly, but women tend to go for jobs where they check, 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10 of their criteria. Whereas men, I mean, I don't remember the exact number, but like 5 or 6 check marks. It's like, I'm good to go. And if you think about, the reason you're going for a new job is typically because you want to grow. You want to grow into that role. So if you already know everything because you check all the marks, then you're probably not going to gain as much, right? And I think the lack of minorities or women of color, I'll just say women of color, but I really mean minorities, but it'll just be easier for me. Is that when you don't see examples of people who are different, it's sometimes hard for you to also put yourself in that position. And I mean, it's almost like, yeah, it's obvious. Like you just want to see more people that look like you. But I think the difference, at least to me, a ground changing moment was when I looked at leadership, I saw a certain kind of leadership because all the leaders I saw looked the same and acted the same. And then I met a leader who was a woman, and she was just different. She was, not as aggressive, just more human in a way. And I started to question, like, because when I thought of myself, I was like, I will never be a leader. Like, I'm not one of those people that will say, yeah, this needs to be done and like, pound it. But that's what I had seen. So to me, the diversity piece also has to do with not just even physically, but in terms of personality, in terms of how you relate to people. Do you see a certain type of people always being at the top? Because if you do, then you start to have this unconscious thing in your head that goes, well, I don't really relate to that style. Therefore, I'm never going to get there. But what's really needed is you have a different kind of skill set, a different kind of ability, a different kind of way of relating to people that is needed to actually change everything else, right? So I just think it's really, really important, not even just to focus on gender and all these other criteria, but even just lived experience. I worked with someone who moved to Canada as a war refugee, and the way they saw the world was just different. I would never be able to come up with some of the things they came up with because I never really lived through war, right? So to me, it's also acknowledging that it's not just about your hard skills, what you learned in school, the degree you have, but a lot of your lived experience brings something else that a lot of people just cannot even come close to, um, to giving to the world. So yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah, I think that was really insightful advice, I think, for the both of us. Yeah, thank you. Before we continue, we just like to thank our sponsors. So this episode is sponsored by the City of Brampton, which is the second fastest growing city in Canada. The City of Brampton is focused on innovation and supporting small businesses and industries. With resources like the Brampton Economic Development Team and the Brampton Entrepreneur Center, the city is investing in our future and our success. And we're grateful to the city for their support of our initiative since 2019.
So moving on, now it's time to announce the winner of this week's contest. On our Instagram, we put up a question for this episode, which was, what do you want to pursue in the future? So this week's winner is Shiv J. Make sure to follow Spark Hacks, and congratulations, Shiv, for winning this contest.
All right, so now we'd like to play a quick game that Rajul and I have aptly titled What's the Difference, where we'll ask you to tell us the difference between two industry terms. So for our audience, if you're new to design or you just want to learn more about innovation design, Suzanne is here to break it down for you. So the first question we have is, what's the difference between UX and UI design?
UX is more of the process, UI is more of the tangible visual. So, and maybe I'll just quickly give you an example. I don't know how much time I have to explain these things, but when you think of a website or an app, what you see visually, the buttons, the colors, the fonts, that's UI. But in order to find the right UI, you have to go through a whole process of understanding, what is this person going to do on this page? What is this person trying to, let's say it's a shopping app. What is this person trying to purchase? How am I showing it? Is it going to be an image? Is it going to be a video? Is it going to be a text explanation? So basically thinking about the path or the things that the user needs is what will be the UX piece, and how do you make that experience as smooth as possible? And then the tangible result of, okay, how do I now concretely express that to the person will be your UI, which is the interface.
All right, awesome. So the next thing is, what is the difference between wireframing and prototyping?
I would say wireframing is a lot more, when I say UX, I mean digital UX, because user experience could be the experience when you go to a spa. That's user experience in a different context. But I think when you're thinking of an app, again, or a website, it's the very the skeleton, I'm going to invent some words here, the skeleton of what it would look like. So going back to the UI example, if you went to a website, let's pick Netflix for the sake of ease. Actually, you might have seen it when it loads really slowly, you'll see like boxes, like a gray box, like a little rectangle that's supposed to be text, where the logo goes. So a very high level visual of the structure and interactions would be the wireframe. To me, prototyping is more general. So it has to do more with anything you're trying to build or develop, and you're trying to find a very cheap, low scale, low resource way of testing it will be a prototype. So for instance, if I'm trying to prototype a car, I could just draw a car. That's a prototype, but it's not necessarily a wireframe. So to me, the wireframe is more in the very digital app, mobile context, but the prototype could really be expanded to any field or industry.
So our next one is, what are some of the differences between diversity, inclusion, and equity?
Okay, so diversity is the fact that you just have difference, whether it's people, experience, whatever those criteria that make the difference. Inclusion is the way you make people feel like they are part of whatever it is. So whether it's inclusion within a team, or inclusion in terms of accessibility, etc. And equity to me it's very tied to inclusion, but it's how do I include people in the way that works for them? Equity would be, I'm not trying to force you to work with what I think is inclusion, because you're still kind of in your head with your bias, but it's really understanding what would make this person feel included in a way that is acceptable and pleasant for them.
Yeah, so that was really informative. Like I mentioned before, I'm more into the non-technical business side. So I learned a lot about design. I actually didn't know the difference between wireframing and prototyping and all those words. I just didn't know what any of them meant, but I'm glad I could learn that. So now we're here for the most important questions of all, the rapid fire segment. I'm going to quickly ask you questions, and you just have to give your first answer that comes to the top of your head. So first, Apple or Android?
Apple.
Your favorite hobby?
My favorite hobby? Biking.
Ooh, that's fun. Chocolate or vanilla?
Chocolate.
Your favorite food?
Pizza.
Same.
That's interesting.
Summer or winter?
I wouldn't even say pizza, but that's the first thing that came to mind, which is pretty funny.
Summer or winter?
Summer, for sure.
That's the right choice.
I know.
What show or movie are you watching right now?
So I just started this show called Lupin on Netflix. It's amazing.
And finally, if you could have one superpower in the entire world, what would it be?
To bring people together. I think a lot of the conflict, the extra fluff we have on the planet is just people not trying to understand. I'm not saying we all have to agree with everything, but even just understand a perspective that's not ours. So I would say that would be the superpower that I would want to have.
That's really sweet.
Yeah, no, it's really wholesome. I think when Virgil first asked me the question, I think I said like teleportation, so I just feel like a bad person. Yeah, I think that may have been the most important information that we discussed in this episode. And yeah, I think you've obviously had a really cool career so far and had some amazing experiences. So what would you say to your 18-year-old self if you could like talk to them now?
Don't be afraid, I would say, is the number one thing. And be yourself. That's two. But I would say they go hand in hand in that, again, when you're a minority, there's just a lot of things you don't think are accessible to you. But as I was lucky, I had a lot of coaches and mentors that made it just seem normal to be there. But in hindsight, without those people, I don't think there's a lot of things I wouldn't have tried. There's a lot of risks I wouldn't have taken. So definitely, like, be yourself. Sometimes you're in the room and you just have a perspective that is so different from everyone else. And at the beginning of my career, I would really, really shy away from it. I wish I'd spoken out more, because there was a few things that I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I could say this and I just didn't, but I wish I did. So don't be afraid and speak your mind, obviously respectfully, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for us as well as high school students. So I guess kind of just to end our discussion off, do you have anything in general that you would want to tell our audience?
I'd say don't be afraid to reach out. You would be surprised at the number of people out there willing to help you. Google it and reach out to them. You won't get 100% responses, but a lot of people will get back to you. So I'd say develop your network. That's another thing I had to learn the hard way. But your network is really, really important going forward, up and down. So don't just develop your network with senior people, but also junior people.
Thank you so much. This has been a really, really great discussion. Thank you for joining us, Suzanne.
Thank you for having me.
All right, awesome. So thank you everyone for listening. You can find out more about Spark and all our other initiatives on our website at startthespark.ca, our Instagram at Spark Hacks, our Twitter at Spark_hackathon, our Facebook at Spark Hackathon, and our LinkedIn at Spark. We are clearly everywhere. And be sure to stay tuned for next week's episode where we interview someone else that's also very interesting. Thank you, everyone.